Whew. All right, people. You had, we've been talking about fruits of the bearing fruit this year. Y'all were bearing a lot of fruit this morning. Patience. Most of you were pretty kind. Nobody was cussing or yelling at me over text, so that was good. You were pretty gentle by saying, "Hey, it's not working." So y'all give yourselves a pat on the back for being full of the fruit this morning. So I appreciate that. There was a lot that I had to cover today. I may have to push a lot of it into next week because it's really just that good. Not that I did it. It's certainly not what I created or came up with. But I will say this: the enormity of this subject is significant for a lot of reasons. And so, working through all the technical difficulties, all the folks who are on the dial in heard me doing all sorts of things. Generosity is a significant part of Christian community. Generosity in relationships. So last week we talked a lot about time and hospitality, and it probably didn't seem entirely practical in the scope or in the sense of what's going on right now with our quarantining and locking down and all that kind of stuff. And the reason I wanted to go over those two is it kind of was about a third of the whole. And this week with relationships, it's about 2/3 of the whole. And what I mean by that is that as we spend several minutes here talking about, what this is, and I'll give you guys some scripture to look into, and then next week we'll probably spend more time on this. Hopefully Zoom will have figured some things out, and we'll have got to a better place next week. But one of the things that's important about generosity in relationships is that relationships, and I was thinking about this yesterday as I was working on this, and this morning as I was working on this. So a lot of times we think about relationships and we think about the context being, all the fun that we can have and all the good things, and maybe it's an elementary, kind of condition that we think about relationships. Think about elementary is quite literally elementary of when we're little and the fun that we have and everything else. But at the same side, on the other side of that coin, are the things that kind of go on. And when I talk to my kids a lot about things that go on at school, they're getting frustrated with kids one day, their best friends another, and it kind of is a back and forth. And the thing about relationships that Christ starts to talk about, especially in Luke, and there's other parts that kind of go into forgiveness and debt and everything else, is the centrality of relationships in a Christian community is significant. You'd say, well, I know that, Jonah. What's the big deal? No, it's actually the basis for relationships in a Christian community is not just about forming relationships and having fun. In fact, the other side of the coin about relationships in Christian community is something entirely different. And Jesus goes over that, and it covers a lot of that, not only throughout his entire ministry, but he does it especially in the book of Luke. And he did it the first part of Luke. He's kind of done it in some other things that we're trying to do and think about our Christian identities. But the idea and the concept around relationships in the gospel is a lot different than we think. And so I want to do some recapping of last week. I want to set the stage for what I want you guys to spend some time, hopefully, want you guys to spend some time on this week. And then next week, we're going to get into it some more. It's just there's not enough time today, and all the fun that we had being patient and kind and gentle with your beloved host right here in front of you. We'll see what kind of we'll see what kind of forgiveness you guys have next week when we really get into it. And I say that kind of laughingly. But the reason I've also got generosity around this, and I wanted to kind of go over some of this too. The reason I also have about generosity. Community is important, and the generosity is significant because there are so many of these things that are currency, not just our money. I mean, our money is so significant in furthering the kingdom in a practical way. Supporting missionaries, supporting the work that we do at our church building, supporting people with salaries at the church building, paying for the lights. I mean, our money is a currency quite literally. But the other forms of currency that we talked about in time and hospitality are significant because our time is something that we only have so much time. There's only 24 hours in a day. We can't make more time, right? We can't make more. Um, we can't make our days last longer than what God has in store for us. So our time is so incredibly precious. Number one, and our hospitality is really important too. And somebody had mentioned to me last week that availability was as much of a thing about hospitality, and I think that was spot on. Being available to people. When you think about God's availability to us, when we talk about praying without ceasing, we talk about so many things. God is forever available, right? When we pray, when we have burdens, when we have something, He says at the end of Matthew, "And I will be with you until the end of the age." I mean, He's there all the time. And so availability is a currency. Why do I keep saying currency? Because there's a value that we place on these things. There's a value that we have in our lives for all the things that we do. We place a value on our work. We place a value, and that's what a couple of weeks ago when we were spending time talking about our identity. If it sounds like I'm kind of beating it over the head, I think it's important because the thing that we're going to start to get into about relationships is that there's a value that we place on the actions of others. There's a value that we place, good or bad, on what happens on our interactions with other people. And so we're going to start a little bit this week. And I want to get into these things, and this is probably all we're going to have time for today. And again, I am so thankful for your patience and bearing with us as we work through all this. The enormity of forgiveness. It's a significant thing. And you think, okay, Jonah, whatever, I get this. You're talking about forgiveness, Christ died on their sins, forgiveness, I get it. Well, if it was so simple, if it was so easy, then Christ wouldn't talk as much about forgiveness as he does. He wouldn't talk about forgiving and loving as much as he does. He wouldn't talk about it from such a significant way that he does if it wasn't such a problem, if it wasn't such an issue for us as individuals, for us as a community of faith. And so in this portion of Luke that I'll read here in just a minute, there's a significance, and it's talking about forgiveness and the number of times, because people, again, their minds, and you start thinking about this, how many times should we do this? How many times do we forgive? How many times? Because again, the old law was talking about offerings. It was talking about, I need to go back. I don't like that. I didn't mean to forgive. I'm sorry. I don't want to do that. I want to do just this one. My bad. Yeah. My apologies. We think about how many times our I think we're having a hard time with the waiting room, and I'm going to go ahead and just get that out of the way. We have a hard time thinking about, and I know that man, I tell you, my apologies. What a day. We have a hard time thinking about like a lot of the first century Christians did, because there were so much lists when you think about what they offered sacrifices for. We think about so many things that they did that were so list driven, so legally thought of. And he starts this portion of Luke, and I want to go ahead and read it. And this is going to be what I'm going to ask you guys to spend some time in this week, reading over it and thinking about it. And he ends with a parable that's kind of hard to work through. That's going to be a lot of what we're going to be focusing on next week. But he starts this off in Luke 17, verses 3 through 10. That's what we're going to read. Be on your guard. If your brother sins, rebuke him. And if he repents, forgive him. And if he sins against you 7 times a day and returns to you 7 times saying, I repent, forgive him. The apostles said to the Lord, increase our faith. And the Lord said, if you had faith like a mustard seed, you would say to the mulberry tree, be uprooted and be planted in the sea, and it would obey you. Which of you, having a slave plowing or tending sheep, will say to him when he has come in from the field, come immediately and sit down to eat? But he will not say to him, prepare something for me to eat, and properly clothe yourself, and serve me while I eat and drink, and afterward you may eat and drink. He does not thank the slave because he did the things which were commanded, does he? So you too, when you do all the things which are commanded, you say, we are unworthy slaves. We have done only which we ought to have done. Now, the first part is what we're going to spend a little bit of time on today. And that is, how many times do we do something 7 times? Well, if you drink a lot of water, you're going to go to the bathroom probably 7 times a day. That's fair enough. But when you think about the significance of how many times that he said in a day, the number seven is significant, of course, and we know that. Um, but his point wasn't so much about the salience of giving him literally seven. He did this before, remember, where he says, seven times, how many times do I forgive my brother? Not just seven, but 70 times seven. I mean, his point was it's never ending. It doesn't stop. So the significance of the seven times is not only, salient about the culture in that day and time, but he's giving them a really high bar. He's giving them a standard. And Luke covers this a lot. Luke goes into a lot about love and forgiveness. When we think about the Christian community, again, it's just like this drumbeat. It's just kind of like this constantness. It's kind of like this theme that's repetitive and it's repetitive and it's repetitive. And you think, what was it were they not getting? But one of the things that he does there at the beginning, and this is what we'll hit on, and this is one of the things that at least, at the very least, I'm glad that we're going to get to today. We got a lot of lawyers at Falls Church. Maybe we have more lawyers per capita than a lot of other churches in other places. And when I think about this word, I think about when a lawyer, you would ask them, can I do this, or is there, what about this? And they say, nope, you can't do that. And there's a lightning bolt of authority that someone has in a position like that. When they tell you no, of course, a lawyer never tells you yes or no. Let's be honest. Lawyers are much more wordy than that. And I say that in great affection to all the lawyers that I share a faith and community with at Falls Church. They know why you can't do something, but when they say it, when they give you advice, you're generally, if we're speaking, I think that we all listen to that and say, okay, I can't do that. Here's why I can't do that. They're educated. They have a law degree. They have experience. They've done different. I mean, there's so much authority that comes with when they say that you can't do something. And there's very few people like that. Now, there's parents can tell their children not to do something, and we can kind of get into it, but please don't get lost in the analogy, because what I'm trying to say is that when Jesus starts this, the very first thing he says to him, be on your guard. Be on guard. Be careful. And the whole thing, this whole section of Luke is couched in a way where he's telling them to be careful. In Proverbs, we see where the book of wisdom talks about watching over your heart, because out of it flows the spring of life. Watch over your heart. And so much of what we start talking about and having in the New Testament not only is our heart, and we're going to get to later talking about idols and other kinds of things that get rooted in our heart, but he couches this entire thing, this entire section. Be on guard. Be careful. Hold on a second. And we read in Hebrews 12 that the root of bitterness defiles people. That our heart, that root, when those things get in there, and whenever that stuff really takes root, it really gets in there, we're defiled by that bitterness. We're defiled by that anger. We're defiled by those things. And so Jesus starts this portion of this entire next week and the rest of the time that we've got today talking about forgiveness and talking about these things and these challenges that we have, about us individually being on guard and being careful about what this entire thing is. Again, the enormity of forgiveness is significant. And the things that cause us to not forgive, the things that cause us to withhold, the things that cause us to act a different way, you might remember when we were doing our study in Colossians, that Paul, as he was encouraging and talking to the church about how strong a faith that they had, how great that they were doing, how many things that they had that were so positive. And he said, your faith is so strong. You guys are doing great. And as they had started to have such a great faith, they started to kind of become a little bit more challenging and difficult to one another. They were harder on one another. And he kind of went through a list of kind of the old ways of things. And he started kind of giving that list of immorality and impurity. And then he kind of brought up a newer list. And he said, in a likewise manner, make sure these things aren't here either. Make sure that you don't have anger and you don't have these things. And one of them was wrath. And this is where I want to spend a little bit of time as we kind of wrap up this portion, is that one of the interesting things about the word wrath is it's some of the root words that it comes from include a wreath And as you think about a wreath, is usually kind of bent and twisted, and it's all kind of whatever. And a wraith is a ghost. And so when you think about, what a wraith is, a ghost of something, the kind of the remnants, the old, just a ghost of yourself. The root of that, the strength of that word, the places that word goes in terms of kind of what it was and what it means. Wrath gets you all twisted up. Wrath just gets entangled. It just kind of envelops you, like so many things do. Paul used that in Colossians to try to say, this is what you don't want to have. This is not a part of your identity. And he had several other things that he listed out there. But when Jesus talks about forgiveness and relationships, he tells them immediately to be on guard. He tells them immediately, you've got to be careful about this. And so much of what was in an Old Testament and the old law, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and, when someone sins against you, you'll do this. I mean, there was so much about repayment that you start to think about, well, at the same time though, Jonah, or, talk about this in the Old Testament, and he's bringing about a whole different way. He's fulfilling a whole new covenant. It's a whole new way of thinking. It's a whole new system. It's a whole different way of approach. And he took such great care in so many things in Luke, writing to such great lengths about love and forgiveness in the book of Luke, among many other things, that when you think about when we first started this, the first part of Luke, whenever Jesus was talking to his disciples and he had just picked his apostles, and he was giving them so many things. And this is what I want to leave you with. If you want to go back and read that, there were some of the things that he did, the blesseds and the woe tos, remember? And we talked about, which one are you? Are you a blessed or are you a woe to? But one of the things he started talking about at the very end was putting on love. But most of all, love one another. Put on love. And he also talked about this. When you lend money to one another, don't expect anything back. At a day and time in the first century when money was a significant currency, money was hard to come by. If you had great wealth, you were really something. He creates a picture to a group of people that both had nothing and everything, and he's telling all of them at the same time, don't lend expecting anything in return. And as we get into this over this next week, and we start thinking more about what forgiveness really is in relationships, it's about repayment in that same manner. Some of the same words that he uses at the first of Luke that we're talking about money, he talks about in this section of Luke about repayment of wrongs and paying off debts that others have done to us. And the root of Christian community in this context of generosity, of hospitality, time, and relationships is focused around forgiveness. And it's not just forgiving people 7 times a day, by which the apostles and you would say, you really, you want me to forgive somebody 7 times in a day if they keep doing the same thing over and over? Well, that's what the apostles said too. Well, give us more faith, Jesus. And he went into a story and he started to give them a parable that we'll spend more time on, that I want you to study and look at and think about. That it's not so much that he waved a wand or he just put his hand on them to give them, quote, more faith. He actually gave them some more admonishing and gave them a little bit more to think about, when it wasn't so much about the strength of faith, but it was about their perspective that he was trying to change and get them to think about when it came to forgiveness and community. So we've got 10 or 15, we got about 10 or so minutes, and everybody's going to try to get around and get ready and situated for church, maybe some more coffee. I hope that you will spend some time this week reading through Luke. I'd encourage you to look at some of Proverbs and Hebrews, because the centrality of forgiveness in Christian community is one of the most significant parts. When I was talking a couple of weeks ago about not only our identity, we talked about some of the difficulties that we have with one another in terms of Christians, and some of the most difficult people that you and I have been around have been Christians. Some of the most difficult situations that we've been a part of or involved with have been at churches. And sadly, there are so many things that entangle us, that we get so upset about, that we get so offended, and we feel so justified because of all sorts of things, that as we really get into this, Jesus really calls that on the carpet, and he does it here at the initial part by saying to be on your guard, because it's so important that as those things really get into your heart, into your mind, into your psyche, and we're going to talk about forgiveness of people, we're going to talk about the situations. It's going to seem practical, but at the same time, it's really central to us as people, us as the individual, as us the contributor to the community of faith, that we realize that the community of faith is one of the most amazing gifts that God gives us. And in that community of faith are people. And within that community of faith of people, there's a whole lot of sinners. And we start to look at how some of those things in Colossians come to bear when Paul is talking about how strong their faith is, but they're still holding on to stuff. They still have things that are deep down. And so we're going to spend time looking at the importance of relationships in Christian community, but as it pertains to forgiveness being the backbone of those relationships, and not so much about how all these wonderful things make us better and make us happy and everything else. It's in fact, it's an entirely different deal. It's going to be centered around the idea and the concept that relationships in Christian community are about forgiveness, forgiving others. And to some degree, it's maybe about how you can learn to forgive yourself as well. Because it kind of comes around about, some of these expectations and all these different things that get tangled up. And if you think about it, as I try to wrap this up here, if you think about it, some of the biggest troubles and problems that we have with relationships and people are very, very long lasting. And they go on for a whole long time. And they give us a lot of bitterness and bad taste in our mouth and negative feelings and make our stomach hurt. I mean, they cause all sorts of anxiety and frustrations. And so human relationships really are the things that bring up or absolutely tear down. And in a community of faith, it's one of the most significant parts. So I hope you'll read some of Luke 17. I hope you'll think about some of that, pray about some of that, reflect on some of those things, read through. Next week, we shouldn't have any technical problems with Zoom. I am really sorry that it took so long. We were trying hard, and the sound booth upstairs to Josh, we were all just really handing a lot of stuff off and trying to figure it all out. The folks that dialed in, of course, we only have a limit on dialing in, so don't everybody dial in next week or it's not going to work. They heard it all, and so I appreciate everybody's patience. You bore a lot of good fruit this morning, and saw a lot of you folks logging in and coming back in. You probably didn't catch a whole lot of it. Thankfully, this is being recorded, and maybe you can watch it later in the week. But we've got church here in about 10 minutes. I really appreciate y'all's patience and time. We'll pick up here next week and have a great study about relationships and generosity when it comes to Christian community. Thanks, everybody.